So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our new ITSS webinar. So this year, it's a year of elections, so we're following the same thread. We had webinars on the Indian elections, on the Taiwanese elections, and so tonight we decided to gather again and discuss the European Union elections, which were just held recently. For those of you who are not familiar with the format, we just start with a discussion between our experts, and then we move on in the end of the webinar to the Q&A session, where you will be able to just ask questions and engage directly with our experts. So we are seeing the effects of these elections reverberating now in the European Union, and just recently we were discussing what was happening in France. And so tonight we are really trying to break down these elections and try to understand the implication they have for some important issues. We're going to talk about foreign policy. We're going to talk about security policy. We will discuss migration policy and also relations with the neighbor, contentious relations with the neighbors like the UK and the Western Balkans. And so, as usual, we have a great roundtable of experts tonight. I would like to thank you all for being here, starting from Dr. Pablo Biderbost, Associate Professor at the University of Salamanca. Thank you so much for being here. And then moving to Benedetta Morari, PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Christian Costamagna, a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Leipzig. I hope I pronounced that well. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you to you for the invitation.
And last but not least, we have two of our ITSS research members, John Devine and Valentina Gruarin. Valentina Gruarin, researcher in the UK and European Affairs team. Welcome.
Thank you.
And John Devine, a researcher, analyst, and also as our UK regional manager. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so just before we get to discuss more complex issues, Dr. Pablo Biderbost, I would like to ask you just to jump in and maybe make a very brief recap of what happened during these elections before we actually get into the complexities. So just what have we seen? What happened during these elections? What was significant? If you can recap that for our audience.
Many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this virtual panel. Good afternoon to everybody. I have some notes that I'm going to read in order to avoid exceeding my time. Of course, this is a not exhaustive summary of patterns and consequences related to these elections. Here, I'm going to introduce and rework some tendencies detected in this scenario by Politico, World Economic Forum, and European Commission itself. First element, some characteristics of the election. Many of them very known for those who are here today in the virtual debate. The election for the European Parliament are held every 5 years and are managed, as everybody knows, by national governments. Last month, 720 members of parliament were elected, 15 more than in the previous elections. The number of lawmakers elected from each European Union country is based on regressive proportionality. This principle means that members of parliament from larger countries represent more people than lawmakers from smaller countries. Germany, for instance, elected 96 members of parliament this month, while Malta elected only 6. There is always some extent of criticism of the electoral rules chosen, even more at times of the incorporation of new candidate countries. As it is usually the case during the European Parliament election, citizens across the bloc use their vote as de facto referendums on their national governments. This took place again last June. Second pattern, central role of the European People's Party. From its position of power, the EPP is best placed to set European Union policy, shaping the agenda to the right. We are the party of industry, we are the party of rural areas, we are the farmers' party of Europe, Manfred Weber, the leader of EPP group in the parliament, said recently. While the EPP decided once again join a grand coalition with the socialists and liberals, it could also negotiate a working relationship on some issues with parties farther to the right if it can do so without alienating its centrist allies. Pattern number 3, Greens and Renew, I mean liberals, have lost presence in the parliament. Paradoxically or not, this took place after the Green Deal legislature, where both had a central role. Fourth pattern, extreme right performance. In France, the far-right Front National, which campaigned on anti-migrant ticket, won third of the votes. The results, as everybody knows, prompt Emmanuel Macron to immediately dissolve the French parliament and call a snap election with the changes in the French party system that everybody knows now. There were setbacks for centrist parties in Germany too. Chancellor Olaf Scholz saw his Social Democratic Party forced into third place behind the alternative for Deutschland. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, rather of Italy, similarly succeeded with more than a quarter of voters backing the group. If the far right were to form a single group, it would be the second largest force in parliament, behind the traditionally dominant European People's Party. The disagreements within its ranks made that scenario unlikely, but their stronger presence will put rightward pressure on European Union policy. And finally, as pattern number 5, there is a clear risk even more of polarization. The success of far-right parties in the European elections is further reflection of the political and social polarization seen elsewhere around the world. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2024 ranks societal polarization as the world's third most serious risk in the next 2 years. The polarization risk, the report notes, is even more relevant than ever this year due to the high number of elections taking place. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pablo Biderbost, for this recap. And so, also, as you mentioned, we saw, for example, in France, a rise of the Le Pen party with the anti-migration ticket. And so you have, moving into the contentious issues we want to discuss, you have extensively researched on migration policies. And so one question I would like to ask you, in the light of all the outcomes you were highlighting, how do you think this election could or could not have an impact on the migration policy of the European Union? And what do you see as the challenges in this sense?
Many thanks for this question. The challenges are so many, the consequences are so many too. Here I'm going to use the same logic that I used before. I'm going to introduce some ideas and rework them offered by Fragment, the famous international law firm, and Info Migrants, the consortium of French, Italian, and German public media, in order to cover not only economic but also social dimensions of the European Union migration policy. First element of pattern, which is the European People's Party agenda. The 2024 election winners' migration manifesto focused on controlled migration and respect for fundamental rights. Their main priorities include reinforcing the control of external borders, improving the screening and monitoring of irregular arrivals, expanding Frontex staff, and developing IT and other infrastructure to protect European Union borders. Second pattern, European Parliament role. As everybody knows, traditionally, it was a progressive institution championing inclusive immigration policies. Now the Parliament's future posture on immigration might lean more towards the right and result in a further slowdown of the European Union legislative process. Other important element, our third pattern, is related to the Europe skills shortage and aging population. In this new political cycle, European policymakers will have to balance several conflicting aims. The green and digital transitions are expected to remain high on the European Union policy agenda. It requires a skilled workforce that Europe currently does not dispose of. Europe's aging population aggravates this need as the current labor shortage cannot be filled solely by the existing workforce, underlining the necessity of bringing and retaining talent to sustain economic growth and innovation in our country. Pattern number 4, presidencies of the European Council. Presidencies of Hungary this semester and Poland next semester are expected to have an impact on migration. These countries, as everybody knows again, have recently adopted several restrictive measures at the national level, and they will try to export, to sell these reforms at the European level. Pattern number 5, role of European Union policy makers. Of course, they will focus on finalizing negotiations on current open files, such as the European Union talent pool for matching employers with potential migrants coming from migrant employees, for being exact, migrant employees coming from out of the European Union. And at the same time, they are going to monitor the implementation of already adopted legislation, such as Blue Card for attracting talented migrants and single permit and unique European Union permit of residence for long-term people living in the European Union countries. And a final pattern, and this is like a kind of recommendation for companies taking into account the current political scenario, not only at the European Parliament, but also taking into account other institutions in the European Union. Employment verification tools and work-ready assessment tools are suggested to be incorporated for facilitating the circulation of expatriates in multinational structures. They are very helpful in a context in which several European Union countries are right now actively monitoring post-migration compliance. Thanks for letting me talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Biderbost. And still remaining on this topic, Valentina Gruarin, I think your research is closely related to this issue. So talking about migration and also talking about the southern neighborhood, what are the prospects in this region for the future? And also, what do you think should be the priorities for the European Union if they want to maintain a certain stability?
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss around these interesting topics. In order to understand and examine the prospects of the European policies towards southern neighborhood in the next 5 years, I think it is interesting to look at the symptoms that could lead to a potential review and revision of the European neighborhood policy. It is interesting to look at the last revision of the European neighborhood policy that is quite updated. It has been done in 2015. So after 2015, the European neighborhood policy as a whole has not been reviewed anymore. In 2021, the joint communication between the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the European Commission was published, and it was around renewed cooperation with the Mediterranean, but it was not a review and revision of the European neighborhood policy itself. So it maintained the same line of actions of the European neighborhood policy review of 2015. So which are the symptoms that could lead to a potential revision of the European neighborhood policy in the next 5 years? First of all, the implementation gap, so the incomplete implementation of the European neighborhood policy and of the joint communication of 2021. There have been some gaps in implementing and in translating policy priorities identified in documents into concrete political actions. For example, concerning the support for economies at the micro level, the European neighborhood policy policy framework, and so the European policy, the European neighborhood policy actions, basically have been concentrated just on macroeconomic stability, on containing migration flows, and so on approaching migration with a securitarian lens. And so avoiding to look at migration as a phenomenon of human security, so without understanding also human security around the Euro-Mediterranean space. Also the good governance and rule of law and the conflict prevention and conflict management efforts that were deemed to be necessary when reading the documents, they were not translated, and they have not been translated into concrete political actions. On the contrary, for example, the Memorandum of Understanding between Tunisia and the European Union of 2023 clearly demonstrates that the priorities of the von der Leyen Commission and also of the Council of the European Union, and other institutions aside from the European Parliament, were just centered on controlling migration flows, on joint border management, and on macroeconomic stabilities. But it was not the concrete, it was not what it was written in documents. So these are clear implementation gaps, at least in my opinion. Second symptom are the recent challenges of the European neighborhood. For example, the war in Ukraine, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and also the situation and the war in over Gaza between Israel and Palestine. So if the European neighborhood policy framework is dates back to 2015, you can understand that it is outdated to be used and employed right now to manage crisis and effectively manage crisis and resolve and also create a system of peace building system in those situations. The third symptom is the midterm evaluation of the Neighborhood Development International Cooperation Instrument. This midterm evaluation has been done in June 2024, and clearly highlight some weaknesses of this financial instrument that is also used, but not only used for the neighborhood, for the European neighborhood policy. Some of these weaknesses are the low participation of local actors, the need to consider the impact of EU policies in partner countries, the crisis response that is not enough structured to adequately respond to challenges and crises, and also the lack of investment in expertise. So this is another symptom that could lead to a renewal of the European neighborhood policy and of its instrument. But how this policy will be reviewed, it will depend on the EU institutional balance, so inside EU institutions. And looking at the new key figures that we can understand until now, for example, Antonio Costa, that will officially be the new president of the Council of Europe. He was a former member of the Committee of Regions, so maybe he will try to highlight the role of cities and of regions in the multi-level cooperation system, for example, in the Euro-Mediterranean arena. So it could help in a potential revision of the European neighborhood policy in this sense. Von der Leyen, if she will secure a second term, I don't think that she will change her previous policies towards the MENA region, so basically focusing on security, on joint border management, and on militarization, etc., of borders. And Kaja Kallas, she will likely be the new High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. She is an interesting figure because she is from Estonia, and she is the Prime Minister of Estonia, and she is known for her strong stances against Russia and in defending Ukraine. So it is likely that she will, in a certain ways, she will revise the European neighborhood policy, strengthening the eastern front of the European neighborhood policy, but maybe also the southern eastern front of the European neighborhood policy. So maybe also the Eastern Mediterranean, given the increasing influence of Russia in those territories. Finally, to conclude, I think that the most important areas that should be prioritized are, of course, the strengthening of the EU strategic autonomy and the increase in supranationalism in EU foreign affairs and in particular in the European neighborhood policy, in order to enlarge the scope also of the European political community towards South. Second and third elements, socio-economic development at the micro level, and also the peace building and democracy support efforts at the micro level. And Antonio Costa could be an important figure to promote these and to support these changes. Conflict prevention and management, of course, require an overall revision and large revision, I think, and they are important areas. And also, conflict prevention and management. Also, maybe trying to collaborate with other forums in conflict mediation, for example, with the Arab League or with other regional and international forums in order to mediate into conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. And many of the topics you mentioned, we will explore them further shortly. But one more question, and perhaps a very big question mark. So we have seen in these elections that mainstream parties secured a majority, but we also saw, and it is quite evident, that there is a rise of far-right parties too. And so the big question here is, are we really going to see a shift in these policies you were discussing? Are they really going to have an influence? Or are we actually, and this is something we have discussed before, are we actually overemphasizing their importance and their weight in the European Union? What's your take on that?
So I think I might agree with what Pablo was rightly mentioning on, for example, on the influence that the European People's Party, even if it is a mainstream party, the influence that other far-right movements could have on the European People's Party, because actually European People's Party, even if it is a mainstream party, it is a right-wing party. So I think it could be a target by other far-right parties in general. But in general, inside the European institutional scenario, I think that the impacts can be measured in four main arenas. First of all, in the European Parliament, second in the Commission, third in the Council of the European Union, Councils of Ministers, and fourth, and also important, in the lobbying activity inside the European Union decision-making process. First of all, concerning the European Parliament, that is the only EU institution directly elected by the EU citizens and should represent the interests of the EU population as a whole. I think that far-right parties characterized by their radically conservative, ultranationalist, and sometimes authoritarian ideologies, I think they will be likely to project their national interests onto the supranational stage, decreasing the level of supranationalism inside the European Parliament and increasing the level of intergovernmentalism inside this important institution that is already that has already a weak power in European external affairs, especially. For example, a quick example: if we consider an external threat such as terrorism or a war in the neighborhood or migration intended as a threat, I think that far-right parties and also maybe also the European People's Party might influence the European Commission to adopt policies directed towards the protection of nation-state interests. So, for example, protectionist policies, trade wars, securitarian policies, so rearmament or militarization, and all the kind of measures intended at defending national borders. And this is in stark contrast with the measures aimed at conflict management, resolution, and resolving challenges at their roots. Furthermore, as I was saying, far-right parties grouped as Patriots for Europe and also the European Conservative Reformists could influence the European people parties. Von der Leyen, she is the Spitzenkandidatin for her second term of the European People Party for a second term at the European Commission. So I think that the influence could also be felt inside the European Commission in its decisions, at least. Within the European Union Council, that already has an intergovernmental nature, the far right movement influence could worsen the situation because it could lead the Council of the European Union to put on the agenda. And let's remind that the Council of the European Union is the protagonist of the agenda setting in the European Union decision-making process, or at least one of the main protagonists. So these far-right movements and governments of the European Union could influence the Council of the European Union to adopt conservative policies, and policies again aimed at defending national borders. To conclude, talking about the Council of the European Union, the Hungarian presidency right now is clearly showing the priorities of this presidency until December 2024. For example, enhancing EU competitiveness, reinforcing defense policies, combating illegal migration. These are all priorities of far-right movement or parties. To conclude, the lobbying activity is also an interesting topic to analyze when analyzing the influence of far-right parties. The European Parliament and the Council of the European Union are two of the main targets for lobbying activities inside the European Union. I differentiate between good and public good lobbies and lobbies intended to pursue economic or business interests or political interests. I think that the rise of far-right parties could lead to a monopolization of the lobbying activity by far-right political groups or businesses dealing with security or defense policy. So they could also influence the policy towards a far-right scenario in European Union politics. So, really, to conclude, I'm sorry to take it so long. I think that we are not overemphasizing the influence of far-right parties. And instead, it is really interesting to examine and to study the influence that these parties and movements could have in the next 5 years and also in the medium term. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina. That would be a very good research for the future. Thank you so much. And just to move to another front, but also to connect to something you've been mentioning before, Benedetta Morari, Valentina was mentioning the fact that the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, is most likely to take over the role of the HRVP, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. The current one, Josep Borrell, will step down. His term is finished. And so this is really, I mean, the eyes are on her in Brussels. I would say there has been a lot of talking about her role. She's quite an interesting figure. She's from Estonia. She often claimed that her family was deported to Siberia many years ago. And so she has a background with Russia. She has a past with Russia. And usually she has quite a tough stance on Moscow as well. And so many people are worried that with her role, she might actually over-focus on Moscow and overlook other issues, while other critics are saying that her role is actually not as influential, that actually her power is limited. And so I would like to know, because this is part of your research, what's your thought on that, and how can we expect her to actually influence the Ukrainian war?
Thank you very much, Carlotta, for this question. It is hard to answer it without trying to make predictions, but I will try to stay clear of that and just have a reflection on what she's shown to be and also what her position will be, and what we can expect to see in the future, but also what are some elements that we should pay attention to. So I would maybe start by saying why she's almost appointed, but not quite yet. And that is because the HRVP, that is the High Representative for the Union's foreign and security policy, but also the Vice President of the Commission, is what is called a double-hatted figure, if not even triple-hatted. On one hand, it is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, and it is one of the only non-rotating chair within the Council of the EU. At the same time, it is also a commissioner. It is part of the Commission and also the head of the European Defence Agency. But it's one of the few figures, if not the only one within the EU institution, that is in between the Council and the Commission. And because of it, it is at a very interesting intersection. And that very much essentializes what European foreign policy is and the main struggles that it has to deal with. And that is because European foreign policy is still overwhelmingly under the competencies of nation states, of the member states of the EU. And it is voted mostly through unanimity or consensus among states. Compared to other areas of Commission policy, where the EU institutions have a lot more power and decisions are taken through QMV. So what the HRVP essentially has to do as a figure is to achieve consensus and foster consensus between member states. And of course, foreign policy issues, I mean, to some extent, the war in Ukraine was a particularly easy one, but we can see with the war in Gaza how this is way different. You need to reconcile positions that are incredibly different from member states in order to achieve a single united position on by the EU. So the HRVP per se as a position, I would say that it's not necessarily a weak position, but it's very much what the individual makes of it. Is the individual able to foster consensus between member states and really catalyze a common response on behalf of the European Union? And then if it's not able to do that, is it able to play with what the member states can politically give the EU? And then what are the Commission's tools that the HRVP has at its disposal to kind of circumnavigate consensus? And these are the main two actions that an HRVP has to deal with. And I wouldn't say the position is weak per se, but these are the two challenges that a strong HRVP needs to really manage. And on Callas, so given these two challenges, what can we say? So as Valentina, she was saying before, she's shown to be a fervent supporter of Ukraine and a very harsh critic of Russia. But also throughout her premiership, she's shown that she has been someone that has been able to conjugate very strong ideals and a very assertive stance on many issues with a very good track record of policy pragmatism. So she has been able to convert the strong stances into concrete policies. And this is something that I think will really help. It's some assertiveness that she can take within the council to really make the most out of all of the different instruments that the EU system of foreign policy provides her, to understand how to act and when, which instruments she can take from the Commission competencies, but also what she can get out of the council. On the other hand, she comes from Estonia. And so this means that she's used to coalition politics, and she's also used to really hearing out different voices at the table. And in this sense, it will be, I mean, we will be able to see if, given the skills that she has, she will be able to also cover up the second function of the HRVP, which is really to foster consensus within nations, within the member states. Maybe this is very much structurally what I think we need to pay attention to and what her profile can tell us right now. On the policy side, I mean, we can definitely expect strong support to Ukraine. This, I think, it will be interesting to see how it plays out in case Trump wins the election. Some are saying that Trump, the first thing will be flying to Moscow to negotiate a deal. And in that case, what will the EU do? Does it really have the military and foreign policy power to sustain Ukraine on its own, or will it need to find some kind of a diplomatic compromise with Trump and with Putin to ensure that the peace deal is as fair as it possibly can? It's very hard, again, not to fall into predicting in this case, but we hope that she's able to have the flexibility required by the situation. So on one hand, maybe be able to catalyze the EU's response, but also being able to have a dialogue in case peace needs to be made and the EU doesn't have which is a dreadful scenario, but is a possible one. But in case the EU doesn't have the competencies and the tools to support Ukraine on its own. Lastly, on the rest of the world, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, because she is a commissioner, at the end of the day, she will have to be approved by the parliament in October when the College of Commissioner gets voted. And before that, she will have to have an audience in the parliament. Well, she will get grilled from all sides on foreign policy matters. I understand on that. And I do think that the parliament will really push her on other issues other than Russia. And so she's been receiving this criticism. She will receive it already. And so I think she will try to, I mean, I'm curious to see whether she will listen to it and she will be aware of it as to develop a response to other foreign policy issues. Maybe the last thing I will say about that is that she's been saying that as an Estonian, she's experienced Russian colonial pressure, and that has been a link to a lot of other countries from the global South that have experienced colonial oppression from other European states. And in that sense, I think that's an interesting tie, and I would be curious to see how she plays it out, especially at this moment in which we're seeing a rise of countries from the global South. And the EU needs to deal with them, needs to take care of its relations with Africa and Latin America. And maybe in that sense, not coming from one of the big countries, but coming from an Eastern European country with a past of what she says colonial pressure, might give her a particularly it will help her in this relations. So we'll stay tuned, but I hope I gave some elements of what we should pay attention to in her tenure as HRVP.
Thank you so much, Benedetta, for these very interesting insights. And remaining on this topic, there is another position I think we should pay attention to, but it's not very clear, so I would like you to expand on that. Ursula von der Leyen has often advanced her ideas to establish a new position, the European Commissioner for Defense, but it is quite confusing from the outside because the major question is, what is this role and how does it actually relate to the HRVP? Is there a risk they might clash against each other? And then also, is this actually happening? Is this role being created? So if you can also explain us and share your thoughts on that.
So I will start by saying that I don't really know if anyone has an answer to this question. I don't think anyone really knows what a defense commissioner will be and entail. But I can maybe try to give a few insights on what have I personally understood and where I think we're standing right now.
Do you think Ursula von der Leyen doesn't know? She might be.
Yeah, I think I think what we're seeing right now within the EU is that we have the political power and the competencies for military engagement, intervention, that still reside mainly within the member states. And the few competencies at the European level are embraced by the HRVP in the framework of the Common for Security and Defense Policy at the European level. And as I was saying before, these are voted through unanimity, consensus, and member states are very skeptical about giving up these competencies. And this is like the more political side to it. And what is happening right now, and that's where I answer your question, where does von der Leyen stand, is that because unanimity kind of governs a lot of these political competencies, the Commission, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, has been trying to kind of like go around the member states to still develop some sort of supranational defense competence and escape unanimity. And the way that they've been doing that has been mostly through the defense industry. So where the EU has more extensive competencies over the internal market. Still, defense markets are an exception to the internal market, but through incentivizing common defense projects, research, joint procurement, by funding by giving money to states to then spend it together, and creating projects that can increase production, but also investment. The EU is kind of escaping this, the exceptionalism that the defense industry, the defense market, but also the political part of military intervention and strategy usually entails. And right now, from this point of view, the EU has two main issues, one of which is military production, because production is still, production markets are still at the national level. All countries have their own national champion, and they do not benefit from the economies of scale at the European level. And that has basically created a lot of inefficiency and underproduction, because for member states, it's just cheaper to buy American or buy South Korean because their own national market has higher costs. And then the second part is that there is also just a lack of infrastructure, and member states don't really have enough armaments themselves. So they need to produce more, but also buy more. And through, as I was saying before, the creation of European programs, what have been done, such as the European Defence Fund, EDIS, and EDIP, what they've been doing is that to incentivize member states to produce together and to buy together. So what I think von der Leyen is thinking, and also what Commissioner for the Internal Market, Thierry Breton, have proposed, is to create a defense commissioner that can really isolate those competencies that are currently under the Commissioner for the Internal Market, and really focus on that, on those competencies, and have one commissioner that does that. So that's what, in my interpretation, a defense commissioner will be. But at the same time, because of the structure of the treaties themselves, which do give the power and the competencies for military strategy and intervention to the HRVP under the authority of the Council, it is very unlikely that this commissioner will have competence over the political side of everything that is around defense and military intervention and military strategy. So what we will see is a very impoverished defense commissioner that lacks a comprehensive and dynamic vision over the whole panorama, the whole plethora of EU defense competencies. And in that sense, it will fragment even more defense competencies around the figures. So I don't think it will necessarily duplicate the HRVP, because it couldn't have its competencies and its powers, because the treaties do not give them explicitly to the HRVP, and the Commission cannot easily move them. And also, there's not much hunger for treaty change within the institution, so I think we will not see that. So we will see a weak, maybe not even weak, just like a commissioner for armament or a commissioner for the defense industry. We will not see a commissioner for defense, full stop. On one hand, maybe it's not the best option that we could see, the strongest position that we could give to a EU defense commissioner. At the same time, with the war on Ukraine, increasing dangers and threats at the borders of Europe, and the potential re-election of Trump, and kind of like the American security umbrella over Europe being taken away, the EU should invest in its defense industry, and maybe a commissioner for defense industry is better than nothing at all. So that's what I would say in response to that.
Thank you very much, Benedetta. Very interesting times ahead. We'll keep an eye on this position too. Thank you so much. We try to move away now from this region to a different region. I know it's a lot on the table tonight, but we try to discuss all the most interesting and contentious issues. So we move to a different region, the Balkans. So Dr. Christian Costamagna, that's your area of research. And so we would like to sort of zoom into this area to understand, well, this is probably a quite complex question, but we know that the Western Balkans have been waiting to join the European Union since 2003. So that's quite a long wait. The feeling is that these countries have been stuck in the waiting room perpetuously. And so according to your research, and also according to your role as an historian, what do you think are the root causes for this long period of waiting? And also, why is that happening, and what could change that? And do you think something might change from this point on, or we will just see this continuing for the future as well?
Thank you, Carlotta, for your interesting question. Well, putting in context the Balkans, we have to remember that when the Berlin Wall fell down, Yugoslavia at the time, it was most probably the first country who could have accessed the European community at the time. So, but now, after more than 30 years, we are still discussing about the opportunities and how much time we need to wait before the Western Balkans will access the European Union. So first of all, the destructive war in former Yugoslavia during the 90s, that brought two things. The first one is a Pax Americana, because the European Union was not able to bring peace again in the backyard of its own continent. The second point that we should consider is that the second part is the European Union as a generator of integration and welfare and stabilization. So it is not just military intervention and peace, but also integration, well-being, possibility to move across the continent and reform the institutions in the Western Balkans. So after the fall of Milosevic in 2000, and after those first years of the new millennium, there was this great expectation about the access to the European Union. But then what happened? Several things, because at the time the Balkans in the end were perceived as not on the top of the agenda due to the wars then in Afghanistan before, and then Iraq, and then all the colored revolution in Ukraine, etc. So by the end of the day, in the European Union, the perception of the Western Balkans was they were not so eager to accelerate this process. So they were in a sort of stalemate, just waiting for some change and postponing in a not well-defined future. This is also related to cultural and political aspect, because not everybody in the major European countries favor the access of countries with a Muslim majority or a Muslim component, as it is here in countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina or Kosovo, etc. But there is also a problem that in some of the countries, the boundaries are not and the sovereignty are not still well defined, because Serbia is not going to recognize Kosovo as a sovereign state. Bosnia-Herzegovina is always on the verge of a secession of the Republika Srpska. So this is the view from, let's say, the European Union. So the European Union and the bigger countries are not so interested to let countries with such problems inside the European Union. But on the other hand, we shouldn't simply and only complain the European Union for this, let's say, maybe not failure, but to the least is eternal postponing. Also, the countries in the Western Balkans didn't have enough political capital and courage to endorse some difficult internal reforms in terms of justice, in terms of democracy of the institutions. So this led some countries like Serbia and also other countries. Serbia is not for sure the only one from this point of view, to form some sort of, as politologists love to call them, state capture, illiberal democracies. And so these illiberal democracies are good for the stability from a certain point of view, because after all, after the last clash in Macedonia in 2001, there was no real huge crisis, with a few exceptions. But on the other hand, let's say that in this region, so it was not possible to find, let's say, some catalyst of reforms. So what main obstacle, let's say, lay somehow both in the European Union, but also in the Western Balkans countries themselves, in their political leadership. Now we can expect maybe a change, not only after the new election, the European Parliament, but we can expect some change also because of the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the nomination of Ukraine and Moldova as countries that in the future may access the European Union. So just imagine, from the point of view of Belgrade, of Sarajevo, Tirana, to see that after 20 years they are still stuck in that position, but now due to a conflict in Ukraine, so Ukraine is expecting in the next years to access the European Union. So this generated several different sentiments and emotions, political emotions in the Western Balkans. So I think that it could be used in a positive way. Is change, is a shift in the geopolitical panorama of Europe, and maybe there could be a way to exploit somehow politically this new, let's say, energy toward enlargement, if we can talk, of course, because usually we talk about fatigue of enlargement fatigue, and not a new propulsion toward this political goal. There are several ways, of course, that we can go beyond those well-known obstacles in the EU and the Western Balkans. And it is to give some realistic achievement, and someone called them carrot and sticks. I don't know if it is the best possible way to define and label them, but still, I guess that, for example, just recently in the previous month, the European Union basically is offering to access some investments, some funds in the Western Balkans, for the Western Balkans, if they implement more, to speed up a little bit the internal reforms. For example, the bilateral dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina. So I don't want to make any prediction, because usually they are not confirmed by the reality. But still, I think that if we want to look at the roots, this waiting room, we have to keep in mind all these historical events that happened in the last 20, but also, let's say, 30 years.
Thank you so much, Christian. And focusing on the modern day, on the current events in the region, we've seen an increased influence, an increased Russian influence in the region, but we also have seen the arrival of China with great investments through the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we also see transatlantic cooperation in the region. So we might well say that the Balkans are becoming a quite crowded place, a place of conflicting interests. And so the question here is, what are the interests of the European Union in the region? And is the Russian and Chinese presence also affecting transatlantic cooperation in some way? And will we see the European Union play the role of a main actor, or will it stay more on the sidelines?
Yes, indeed, the Balkans are, as you said, quite crowded. Well, for sure, it is of a vital interest of the European Union to keep the Western Balkans safe without any turbulence or crisis, not to mention the wars of the 90s. This is essential. Yes, Russia and China are exploiting some fissures, then some weaknesses of the European Union, because the European Union often is perceived, especially in countries like Serbia, good for the investment, for the money, but in the end, not anymore, such an important political goal. This is revealed in the last years also by the opinion poll there. But in Serbia, it is maybe 30, 35, 40%, but it is among the lowest rate, the perception, the positive perception of European Union as a goal for Serbia. This said, beside this, I mean, there is also an interest, let's say, in those political leaders in those countries to attract investment from countries, Russia in the energy sector especially, or from China in the infrastructure sectors. And then there is also corruption. So these investment sometimes or often are generating vicious cycle of corruption in the political elite. So, but beside this, that it is per se, of course, a huge problem, it is generating a wider gap between the European Union and the Western Balkans. I mean, where is Serbia heading? I mean, since the middle of the second decade of 2010, I mean, the Serbia is somehow trying again to use political foreign policy partly similar to the non-aligned movement, to socialist Yugoslavia, having friends everywhere in the East and in the West. I wonder if this kind of foreign policy is compatible with a country that would like to join the European Union. So from this point of view, these influences of Russia and China in Serbia and Western Balkans, not just in Serbia, also in Macedonia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially in Republika Srpska. Well, we can expect that the transatlantic relation could be weakened, of course, because if the Belgrade is looking at the political model of Beijing or Moscow, is all said. It is very hard to make any internal reform toward the European Union and towards such a transatlantic cooperation. And I don't expect that if Trump will win the election, everything will change, for example, toward the Balkans. But on the other hand, Serbs are looking at what happened in Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, because the Russian ambassador in Belgrade several times publicly said in the last 1 year, more or less, that Kosovo, maybe, the final outcome may change if the geopolitical environment. So there is some expectation, some illusion, who knows, that with the new Trump administration, with some evolution in Ukraine, in Kosovo maybe can go back to Serbia. So we have to keep an eye on that, but for sure nationalism is exploited by Russia in the Balkans, but not just in the Balkans, also in the rest of Europe.
Thank you so much, Christian. And moving to our last stop before we wrap it up and open the Q&A session for 10 minutes. John Devine, you've been focusing mostly on EU and UK relations, and it's quite an eventful summer in the UK as well, not only in the EU. We just saw the recent elections with the victory of the Labour Party. So when we look at EU and UK relations, what do you think might change, and what do you think it might stay the same in terms of trade and security? What are the patterns we might see for the future?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, if we take trade to begin with, at the moment, the Labour Party has come into power and has said they will revisit some of the provisions within the TCA, not to reopen negotiations, but to look for, shall we say, fine-tuning. There is very little will within the country to reopen negotiations, and there's very little will in the EU to reopen negotiations. But that does lead to some possibilities that have been floated by the Labour Party prior to the election. It was suggested that there might be some policy and regulation alignment, whereby the UK will match EU regulations to help facilitate trade. The downside to this would be the UK would become a rule taker and no longer at the negotiating table. So there is that. And also, there are some other things that could take into place. The UK could join Erasmus again. Currently, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, has talked about looking at specific things, chemical tariffs, and also access to bankers and investors in the City of London. However, it should be noted that the EU will be very unlikely to allow the UK to cherry pick what they want to adjust. And there will be very little chance of huge changes. It will be very much on a case-by-case basis. Saying that, the TCA is up for review in 2026, and this will be quite interesting in terms of what they will look at, where they will try to change things. One of the things that the Labour Party has indicated that they would like to have a look at the free movement of goods, not services, but goods. So this might be a potential point of negotiations in 2026. Moving on from that, the TCA only had provisions for dialogue about security, the second point to this question. There are no formal procedures or structures for relationship dialogue or for security between the UK and EU. Now, this gives the UK a bit of autonomy and potential for increased cooperation. As Benedetta said, a lot of the security and defence issues are made at the member state level. Now, David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary, has said he wants to have a reset of the relationships between the UK and EU member states. Day one, he was in Berlin. And also the Defence Secretary, John Healey, has said he is interested in a EU-UK security pact. Now, again, to engage in any pacts or any commitments would open the door for negotiations, and the UK public do not have the patience for any further negotiations. And also we have to consider the results of the EU elections and the UK elections. We have now got a centre-left government for the first time in 14 years, whilst the EU Parliament is being made up more on the right, and also particularly personal relationships. The relationship between former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has changed. So relationships are actually going to be more complicated than they are, but looking at individual levels, there is place for agency that the UK can take. It has been noted that the UK was very much at the forefront of engaging in support for Ukraine. And it's issues like this that the UK will be able to take some movement. We can look at the way they were one of the first nations to send tanks, to send anti-tank missiles. And there's an argument to be made that helped to galvanize EU nations to do that as well. But also there's frustrations at the tempo of a lot of these schemes and how they are implemented. If we were to take Ukraine, for example, the training of Ukrainian soldiers, the UK initiated their program and they were able to start, whilst in the EU, there was much more consideration about actually starting their own plan, and it was behind the UK plan. Now, this is not to suggest that the UK is, without it, support for Ukraine would not happen, but it is just an indication of what the UK is capable of doing. If we were to look at other examples, Benedetta mentioned about the EU becoming as a defence actor in its own right. There are certain things the UK could do. It could ask to join the European Defence Agency. In terms of actual practicality and benefits it would get out of it, I would say little, but it would help to go along with what David Lammy and John Healey have said of resetting relationships and helping to rebuild trust and helping to build dialogue. Because let us face it, the relationships between the EU and UK have been not great for the past 5 years under the past 3 previous prime ministers who all were in that 5-year period. But there also needs to be some clarification. There needs to be fuller alignment on issues, especially a long-term plan in Ukraine, particularly with, as been noted, the election of Donald Trump. shall we say, the US election in November and the potential election of Donald Trump again, and what that would mean for the European security blanket, and what that would mean for the European and UK support for Ukraine. There also needs to be more coordination on other issues, the Indo-Pacific. The UK is making long-term investments in the defence capabilities there, AUKUS, and there isn't so much of a joint EU policy or plan in that area. So these are areas that can be, there's room for manoeuvring. Also, the EU becoming its own defence actor could help clarify the position, this ambivalence that kind of exists between EU and NATO relations at the moment. Now, that could also benefit the UK in terms of being a member of NATO and its ability to have direct influence in membership talks. So there are areas that could benefit the UK, but this is not necessarily a priority for the European Parliament. They are not looking to readdress things in the TCA at the moment. They're not necessarily looking to address the security issues. There are some case-by-case basis, but there's not going to be a huge review or a security pact, as the UK Defence Secretary has said. These negotiations would be long and they would be arduous. So it is very much going to be on a case-by-case basis, but there are benefits for both sides. One would be security sharing between the UK and EU. That could be an area where there could be a large area for cooperation. Yes. So we have to think about this very much as taking a practical approach on a case-by-case basis. This is going to be very much a case of what is realistic and what is achievable.
Thank you very much, John. And there is another point of tension that I think should be discussed in this sense. That's the Northern Ireland protocol, or Northern Ireland, sorry, protocol. So the idea that there shouldn't be a hard border between Northern Ireland, part of the state, and then the Republic of Ireland, part of the EU. So what's the state of things in this situation, and what can we expect for the future?
Well, without treading up too much of the recent political history of the UK, the previous general election in 2019, the leader of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, proposed a ready meal deal that was on the cards, which was not. And this protracted the negotiations, trying to find a solution to this. Ultimately, we came to the Windsor Framework that came into effect under Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister. But still, there are huge areas that need to be worked on, delaying the movement of people. Even if we were to, if we take another side of this, we look at the position and the opinions of people in Northern Ireland and Ireland. Currently, the largest party within Stormont is Sinn Féin, who is a nationalist party who wants the unification of the island of Ireland. If we go down to the south into the Republic, currently Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, he is in a coalition with Fianna Fáil. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are in coalition due to the rise of Sinn Féin south of the border. And the prediction is Sinn Féin is most likely to emerge as the largest party within the Republic. And we would have Sinn Féin in the north and Sinn Féin in the south. And there has been much chatter that the win of the Labour Party in the UK is only going to benefit the cause of Sinn Féin. But it has been noted by the Labour Party that there needs to be greater emphasis on Northern Ireland. It is only recently that they were able to come back to a power sharing agreement that was stipulated in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the sharing between Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but this is an area that will be that will also fall into the TCA review in 2026 in a couple of years' time. But sentiments are changing in Northern Ireland, and it will we very much watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks to all of you really for answering the questions. I know it was quite a lot of questions, but you all provided very interesting insights. As usual, we stretched a bit too far, so I would say we only have 10 minutes left, but we are happy to take any questions from whoever is left. Unfortunately, Dr. Pablo Biderbost had to leave. Or if you want, you can just step in or type in the chat. And another question is, do you have anything to add, make any comments to what somebody said? Do you want to add anything? Okay. Okay, so I think we can wrap it up. There is no question.
I would just like to ask Benedetta about what do we think are the possibility as the EU becoming its own defence actor, and what your view would be on potential EU-UK relations and EU-NATO relations, if that was to be the case. I know it's a big question.
It is a big question, and actually, when you mentioned the EU as defense actor, you made me start thinking, oh, maybe I should have said something about that. I think right now the discourse is very much still in between intergovernmentalism, like more cooperation and maybe some more joint initiatives, but still very much relying on member states. And then the other idea is that the EU would become like a supranational defense actor on the likes of a federation, maybe with the idea of a common EU army. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical of both of them, and maybe it's not a very diffused opinion, I think, between EU foreign policy people. But I really doubt that there will be the political appetite for complete federal-like integration with a full-on European army. I do think member states are still keen on keeping their own defense capabilities and their sovereignty on defense matter, but also the outside world, like the geopolitical situation around the EU, compels the EU to develop some sort of more integrated defense capabilities. So I really think that we need to stretch a bit beyond what we know to think about the future of EU defense. I think it will take forms that we don't know, we can't put in a box yet. And it will be a mix between integration, coordination, with overlapping structures, and kind of like this mix that we're seeing right now, where there's incentives on the supranational level to do things together without necessarily an obligation, and where member states get more and more trained to act together. And to think with a European mindset and in protection of the entire continent without necessarily pulling in all resources. I mean, NATO sometimes is contradictory, you know, because they're asking more from the Europeans, but then there's also a bit of skepticism on EU integration on defense. And I think the way that if you want more from Europeans, you will need more integration in defense. But at the same time, I don't think it will be duplication, maybe an overlap, but that I think it will strengthen NATO because, you know, if Europeans invest more through economies and politics of scale in common capabilities, they will be stronger contributors to NATO. And the UK, I do think it will be a flexible framework, some model of differentiated integration, and definitely cooperation with the UK, I think will be very appealing in that scenario.
Yeah, I think the Ukrainian conflict has very much shown that the logistics within Europe were much weaker than we could have ever expected. One on our capabilities to produce armaments. And I think this is the elephant in the room that not enough people are talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, and I mean, especially in the case of a Trump election, like it should be a very big wake-up call for the Europeans.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. Like,
Carlotta, I have a flash question, like very quickly before we wrap it up.
Okay.
Christian, I actually have a question for you. So I would like to take you back to the Balkans. 2 years from now, what do you see as the most troublesome reality, as the most troublesome scenario 2 years from now? So if you were to advise the European Union, what would your advice be?
Well, thank you, Michele, for your question. Well, in 2 years, most probably the EU have to avoid at any cost the secession of Republika Srpska, because otherwise that would be a disaster for the region. And the second point is that Serbia has nowadays the biggest army in the region. They bought weapons from Europe, America, Russia, China. So they are not very clear about their real intention about Kosovo. I don't expect that they will start a war with NATO, but still the European Union should do something, very strong signal, some impulse to make it clear that the Kosovo and the relation between Kosovo and Serbia must be solved peacefully, but in a very fast time, because otherwise we will have a sort of Cyprus or South and North Korea, those Taiwan and China. I mean, those are situations that can last decades, but the European Union can't wait decades to solve those problems, because there is already Ukraine. Tomorrow it could be maybe Moldova, who knows? So yes, my suggestion is that the European Union should do something very strong to avoid the beginning, the spark of a new conflict there, because otherwise it will be distract the political energy from bigger issues.
This actually much, Christian. The reason why I asked you is because I teach at the Defense Academy in the UK, and every single year we have officers from Kosovo telling us that they are preparing for war, right? So essentially, that they do not believe in the good nature of the Serbs, of the Serbians, and they're afraid. And so I was just generally curious, so to see what your vision could be, and if you ever want, I can put you in touch with them. It's a very interesting conversation. So just to have like with this officer from Kosovo. But anyway, thank you very much, Christian. Carlotta, back to you.
Thank you, Michele. Okay, if would anybody like to add something?
It's just to say, recently I was discussing with a family friend who's a soldier in the Irish Defence Forces, and he said that is he's currently based in the Balkans, as Ireland is a partnership for peace building with NATO. And he was saying this is where the Americans are putting their focus, in the Balkans now. This is where their next place of focus will be in the coming years and decades within Europe.
Thank you, John. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much for joining us again. I'm just going to stop.